Welcome to Mode Bespoke. I'm Atenas, and today we're going to be working on adding a liner to a knit or a crochet blanket. So let's get started. So here's the Argyle blanket that we worked on last week, and if you want to see the pattern for this, I will link it down in the description box below. But we're going to work on adding the liner to this today. Now, this is a method you can use for any knit or crochet blanket. Now, we are hand sewing the liner on, so you don't need a machine, you don't need any kind of special equipment. But just a needle, some thread or a fingering yarn, and then just a piece of fabric. That's all you need, and you can get started. When I posted about this blanket and this tutorial on Instagram, I was asked to talk about the fabric. So let's talk a little bit about the fabric here. Now, the fabric you choose for this project really depends on the yarn that you used. So now I used wool-like yarn, which I'll leave more information about this yarn on the blog, but the yarn I use is machine washable and dryable. Since this is a baby blanket, it will need to be washed very, very frequently. So that's why I chose a yarn that was machine washable, and I chose a fabric that is also machine washable. Now, the fabric I chose is a little bit stretchy. This is just, I really liked the feel of this particular fabric, and I knew it was not 100% cotton, which is exactly what I was looking for because I didn't want the liner to shrink in the dryer. So just make sure that it's a fabric that has the same type of maintenance or the same type of care that your yarn has, so that it's really easy to care for the finished product. Now, you probably already noticed that this fabric is really thin. So what I did for this blanket is I doubled up the liner. So I cut the first liner, and I just cut the big square, the size I needed for my blanket, and then I cut a second one. That way I could double up on the fabric. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this. It's just because the fabric that I chose was a thin, stretchy one because I wanted the blanket to be breathable. If you're not quite sure what fabric to use, just ask. At any of the shops that you purchase your fabric at, just ask somebody and they'll be happy to help. All right, now what I did is, of course, I'm doing this in a small scale, but what you're going to do is line up your fabric, lay it somewhere where it's nice and flat, and you're going to want to leave about 1/2 inch along all sides of the blanket. So as you can see, the fabric is longer than the blanket itself, and this is exactly what we need because we're going to fold it over. So we're going to fold it over itself twice to make sure that our fabric isn't going to fray, especially if you're going to machine wash your blanket. So now let's talk about the thread you can use. You can sew this just with any kind of sewing thread, or if you're making a blanket using a fingering yarn like this pattern was, you can use one thread of the fingering yarn to sew the liner onto the blanket. So as you can see here, there's a thread of fingering yarn. So it is the same yarn that I had used for this blanket. If you are using a thicker yarn, so you're using a DK or a worsted yarn to make any of your blankets, then you might need to just use regular thread. I suggest you get a thread that is the same color as the border so that your stitching isn't noticeable on the blanket side. To secure the liner onto the blanket, I'm going to use some pins. Now you can use some safety pins if you prefer, but I'm just going to use some of these sewing pins, and we're going to use them when we fold the liner up and pin it down. That way it's a little bit easier to hand sew. So let's get started with this liner. The first thing you want to do is lay it somewhere flat. So whether it's the ground, a table, wherever you can, lay your fabric flat. We are going to fold the edges twice. So we're going to fold it in. So if you left a 1/2 inch, you're going to fold about 1/4 inch. So fold that down. And then you're going to fold it a second time. Fold over, and there you go. So this is just, I'm folding it here so that you can see what the fold is going to look like, but we are going to have to fold this and pin it onto our blanket. We want this fold to be on the inside of the blanket so it isn't noticeable. That way you have a nice clean edge. So I'll grab my blanket, we're going to fold all of our edges over, and then I'll show you how to pin it down. So take your blanket and put it face down on a flat surface. So here's the nice Argyle pattern, make sure it is face down. You're going to grab your liner, place it on top of your fabric, or not on top of your fabric, on top of your blanket. And then you're going to start folding the edges. So remember, we did a 1/4 inch fold to begin with, and then we did a second one. So here's our first fold, and then we do a second fold. And as you can see, the fold is on the inside. Now you're going to lay that fold, so the inside part, you're going to lay it up against the fabric so that it is tucked in between the liner and the blanket. So when you lay it down, make sure that you leave that 1/2 inch along the side. So lay it on the edge and leave that 1/2 inch here along the side so that you can fold that over once you get to that side of the blanket. Make sure you leave that 1/2 inch of fabric along the side of the blanket, and then you're going to take a pin and you're going to pin your fabric down. Now, since I'm going to be working in this direction, I don't want to put the pin facing that way because I don't want to poke myself. So I'm going to turn this over a little bit and place the pin facing in the opposite direction. There we go. And now I can pin down my work without having to worry about poking myself. So take your fabric, make sure that the entire time that you're pinning, make sure your fabric is nice and straight and it's laying flat on your work. As you fold the top part, make sure you line it up a lot with the edges of the blanket, and we're only going to pin one side at a time. So you're just going to fold, pin, all the way across one side of the blanket, and then you're going to sew it down. So here we go. We have folded, line up your fabric with the edge of your blanket. We're going to take our pin, and then we're going to pin it down. And that's it. Continue working this way until you get to the edge of the blanket. Now, it might be easier for some folks to just fold it with the blanket edge facing down, like this. And then you can pin this down. When you're done pinning down the bottom edge of the blanket, we're going to have to pin a little bit into the side of the blanket. So we're just going to pin down a little section, fold it over like we did the bottom edge, and then pin it. To do this, you're just going to lift the corner, and you see your fold right along this bottom edge. You're going to repeat that on this side. So you're going to do your 1/4 inch fold and then another 1/4 inch fold and then pin it down. You're going to have to pay special attention to the corner itself when you pin it down to make sure that everything lines up. So let me get this folded. So your fabric should look like this. And then you're going to line up the corner of the liner with the corner of the blanket. But with the crochet blankets, I'm not sure about knitting, but with crochet blankets, sometimes you don't have a very pointy corner. So you're going to have to pull on the fabric a little bit, or you're going to have to pull down on the blanket. But make sure you line those up the way you want it before you sew it down. Once you got it, pin it down and you're ready to go. And now for sewing. So like I said earlier, I'm going to be using a fingering thread. I find that this makes sewing a lot quicker than just regular thread. But I'm going to use my just one thread of fingering yarn. I'm going to make a knot here at the end. Now you can use a yarn needle or just a sewing needle, whatever you prefer. We're going to hide this knot in the corner. So we don't want it to show through the liner. So we're just going to try to hide it right in this little fold here in the corner. And our first stitch, we want it to come out just a little bit off from the corner of the blanket itself. So I'm going to insert my needle right around here and then poke it through. So I don't want to be exactly at the corner. I want to be a little bit towards the inside of the blanket. So it should look like this. Make sure that you're doing light stitching and it's just superficial stitching on one side of the blanket. You don't want to go all the way through because then you will have highly noticeable stitches on the border of the blanket. So give a nice light stitch just on the back side, and then we're going to fold our fabric back over and begin our stitching. So to hand sew our blanket stitch, the first thing we need to pay attention to is where this thread is going to lay. So we want this to go on the left side if you are sewing right-handed. So hold that down on the right side, and then to begin our first stitch, I'll just show you here on this blanket, I used a finger's width as the spacing between each of the blanket stitches. So that's a personal preference. The same goes for how high you want the stitch to go. So depending on if you want it to be a little more visible, you can do a shorter stitch. If you want it to be more noticeable, just make a higher stitch. So measure about a finger's width from that corner stitch. You're going to insert your needle. So here we go. And then when you're stitching, make sure, like I said, it's going to be a very light stitch. You're going to try to run your needle as close to the blanket's edge as possible. So push that through. Here's where we're going to need our thread to go to the right side. So here's our thread. We're going to wrap that behind our needle. So let's do that again. You're just going to wrap it so it goes behind and under the needle like that. You're going to lay that to the left of the needle, and then the thread that's attached to the needle, so this top one, we're going to also pull it towards the left side and lay it flat like this. And then you just pull your needle through. So we're going to pull this and slow down once you get to the end of the stitch. Pull that through slowly so that you can make sure that the stitch lays where you want it to be. And then see, you're going to have a little knot here at the bottom. All right, so now let's measure out our next stitch. Now this is a lot easier to do on a flat surface. So lay your fabric down flat and you can measure a finger's width. Place my needle right here and then I'll pick it up so you can see it a little bit closer to the camera. So you're going to stitch through. Now again, remember to make this a superficial stitch, because if you push through too hard, your needle is going to poke through the border of the blanket, and then your stitching is going to become very visible. So this is it'll be a little more visible if you're using the same colored thread as you did for the border. So if I would have used an orange thread, it wouldn't have been much of an issue, but I'm using a highly visible thread so you can see what I'm doing. So just make sure it's a nice light stitch that you're going through the liner and the blanket. Okay, now we're going to grab our thread. Remember that it has to go under the needle like this. We're going to lay it to the left of our needle. So I'll just lay it right here on the fabric. And we're going to pull the thread that's up here on top. We're also going to lay that to the left of the needle. So like this. And now we just pull through. So again, we're just going to pull through quickly and slow down once we get to the end of the stitch. So here's your little knot at the bottom. And then you slow down just to make sure that you can line up that bottom thread and the side one and make them nice and even. Take your time. So take the time to line up the stitch the way you want it to look before moving on to the next one. It will make a huge difference when you are hand sewing a blanket stitch. So now we're going to measure out one more stitch over here. Make sure that it's a finger's width. We're going to stitch that through onto the border like this. We're going to lay our thread, so the bottom thread goes to the left, so it goes behind the needle and to the left. The top thread also, we lay it down to the left and we just pull through. And that's it. So the blanket stitch is a really, really simple stitch. All you do is pay close attention when you are pulling on your thread. Now, your thread should look like this. So let me zoom in real quick and tighten this up. So you're going to make a loop with your thread. Now, your yarn should go through the center of the loop. That's what's going to create the knot at the bottom, which is what gives that nice look to the blanket stitch. Now, if your loop looks like this, there's nothing going through it, all you do is just pass your needle right through the center of it, and there you go. You're right back to where you needed to be. And then you just tighten up your stitch. Make sure that it's not too tight. Lay it flat where you want it to go, and then you just continue stitching along the side of the blanket. So I'm just going to keep working here. I'll see you when we get to the corner of the blanket, and I'll teach you how to do the corner stitches. So here's what you would do if you're sewing along and then you run out of thread. So to add new thread, you're going to have to knot the thread that's already on your needle. So you're just going to fold your liner over, and we're going to make a knot on the border itself. So make sure you tighten this bottom stitch. We're going to make a knot about maybe at like an inch into the border. So I'm just going to give a quick stitch going in towards the center of the blanket. And we're going to make a double knot. So make sure that the knot at the bottom of your blanket stitch is now nice and tight before you make this knot. So you're just going to use a regular stitching double knot. So you just go through, knot once, and then go through, knot again. And with this little tail end that's left, we're just going to weave it in like you would any other crochet project. So I'll just give a couple of stitches right here, weave this tail end in, and then make sure you're not going all the way through so that the stitch is visible on the border. So just make it nice and light, only working on the back side of the border. And we're going to cut this little thread. And there we go. Now to pick up the stitch, we're going to fold our liner again. And once you've knotted your thread, you're going to insert your needle in towards where that last blanket stitch ended. So we're going to go through like this. There we go. Here's our little knot. It's going to remain hidden here in the border, and then when we lay our liner on top of that, it won't be visible anymore. So fold your liner again if you need to. Mine unfolded, so I'm going to have to refold it here again. Line it up. There we go. We're going to measure our stitch and then just continue stitching. So there's our blanket stitch. Go through, and there you go. So once you get to the corner stitches, we're going to create this nice little corner. And this is really simple. You're still going to be working with the blanket stitch. It's all about where you're going to place your first or the top of the stitch. Once you get to the corner, go through and do your double fold. So here we go. Line up the fabric with the corner, or not with the corner, with the edge of the blanket, and well, yeah, I guess the corner as well. We're going to line everything up, and then we're going to give one last stitch here on the corner because I want to be a little bit closer. So I'm going to measure it out about here. Let's do one more blanket stitch. And there we go. All right, so that's going to be the first of the 3 stitches for the corner. So we've already done this one. Now we're going to do the next one over, which is going to be this one that's going to be diagonal. We're going to begin at the same place where our previous stitch started. So we're going to insert our needle right up here, which is the same place we inserted our needle for the previous stitch, and you're going to stitch diagonally towards the corner. So here's the corner of the blanket. We're going to stitch this through, and we're going to pull through until you get here towards the end. You're going to slow down, and you want to carefully lay the stitch along the corner of the blanket. So make sure that the stitch holds the liner the way you want it to look. So this may take a few tries. I'm going to try to get it here so that it's holding that corner bit down a little bit and it rounds it out a little bit like this. There you go. And once you have your stitch, we're going to move on to the next one. So we're going to insert our needle into the same stitch that we previously used, but this time we're going to stitch straight across. That way we create the 2 little wedges at the bottom, so for the corner, and then one straight stitch along the top. So we're going to insert the needle here. We're going to line up the stitch and pull through. And there we go. So slow down here. Adjust our stitch the way we want it to look, and there you go. So this is the way I've stitched all of the corners of the blanket. So it's really simple. It is the same blanket stitch that we've used for the edges, and it just gives this nice little kind of, it's like a rounded corner to the blanket. So just continue folding the rest of the blanket, stitching everything down. I'll see you at the end to show you how to finish that last stitch. All right, so we've made it to the very last corner stitch, and now what we're going to do is lay our thread over to the left side of our stitch, and I'm going to hold this down, and I'm going to insert my needle into this last stitch that I just made for the corner, and we're going to sew that through and pull it down. And this is going to make a final knot here at that last stitch. So now, just to make sure that nothing unravels, I'm going to make a second double knot. So I'm going to skip this one and go to the first stitch. This is the very first stitch we did for the liner itself. And I'm just going to double knot. So here's my first knot. And then make that nice and tight and make a second knot. And here we go. And now you're done. So I'll go through and weave in the remaining end of the thread. I'm just going to use the stitches here along the side, and I'll try to hide those under the liner as much as possible. But let me go through, weave these in, and then we'll continue with the stitches that I did here along the inside of the blanket. What I've seen with a lot of liner tutorials and a lot of liner instructions is that they don't add any stitches along the inside, and what happens is that you get this ballooning effect between the liner and the blanket. I don't like that look at all. So what I did is I added a few cross stitches, and that holds the liner onto the fabric a little bit better, and you don't have it popping off while you're washing it or while you're using it or anything. So for this next section, I highly recommend that you use a thread or a fingering yarn that is the same color as the accent color for your Argyle. So in this case, I used orange. But for my example, as you can see, I used that purple thread. And while I was stitching through, See how it sometimes will poke out? So this is why I highly recommend that you use the same color thread as the border when you're sewing on the border. And then when we do the cross stitching, use the same color thread as you did for the accent color. So here's blue that I did for the blue border, and since I did the Argyle also in blue for my blanket, I used that same blue thread for the cross stitching. And now to space out your cross stitching, I wanted it to have a nice design. So I didn't just want the Argyle on one side, I wanted the liner to also have a nice design on it. So what I did is I spaced them out by rows. So I picked all of the blue Argyle. I could have done the beige as well, but I wanted the stitching to pop a little bit. So I spaced them out and worked the cross stitching along columns. So here's an Argyle column, here's an Argyle column, and here's an Argyle column. I didn't stitch in every single Argyle column. So I would skip every other stitch. So I'll show you here on the blanket side. So I did the first full Argyle. So I stitched right here, and then I skipped the next stitch. I stitched in the third, and then I skipped the fourth, stitched in the fifth. So I did this in all of the columns, but I scattered them. That way, oh, and here's a pin. But I scattered them so that it would create a nice design on the liner itself. So here was that first stitch. Now here's that second column. I skipped this stitch and I worked into the second one. In column 2, you skip the first, you stitch in the second, skip 3, stitch in 4, and then we're going to skip the last Argyle. In column number 3, so you repeat what you did in the first column. So you want to scatter these. So for column number 3, I stitched in the same place as I stitched for column 1. So I started in the first Argyle. So because my sample is really small, I'm not going to do that for the sample. I'm just going to stitch along both of these Argyles, and I'll show you how to do the cross stitching, and then I'll let you decide how you want to scatter your stitching on your own blanket. If you're working on a smaller project or you're using a larger yarn, you could just cross stitch in each of the accent color Argyles. That would be just fine too. So let me grab my needle and let's make a knot here on our thread, and we're going to get started. So I'm going to use this purple thread again because I want you to be able to see the stitching. You will be able to see this, it's going to pop on this Argyle, so I highly recommend you use the same color yarn as the Argyle itself. But let's place our first stitch. So I'm going to pick just one of the little rhombuses or rhombi in this first Argyle pattern. And I'm going to stitch through all the way through the blanket and through the liner. So I'm going to pop all the way to this side, and then let's pull this through. Make sure that you have a knot at the end of your thread, and there's that little knot. All right, now let's turn our work around, and we're going to do the first stitch on the liner side. So we're going to do the cross stitch. Now you're going to have to decide whether you want to make it look like just a little cross, so you're going to stitch diagonal, or if you're going to stitch up and down. So stitch up like this and then across. Or again, you can do diagonal if you want to do little X's. I'm going to do just like a little plus sign, so I'm going to stitch up. So here's my first stitch. I'm going to give it a little bit of space. I'm going to push my needle through the liner and in towards the blanket so that I come out on the other side. So here we go. And there's the needle. We're going to pull that through. And there's our stitch. So now to cross that, so we want it to look like this, and we want our stitch to lay right across the center of it. Since I can see my knot right here, I'm just going to place my needle in between where that stitch started and where it came out on the other end, and then just poke that through. Now on this side, I'm going to make sure that I line it up where I want the stitch to lay. So there it is. I'm going to push that through. And then I'm going to insert my needle right across. So here, we're going to lay our thread right across this way. We want to leave as even a spacing between the stitches as possible. So try to line it up as close as you can. Poke through the other side of the stitch like this. And just pull your needle through so that you end up with a little plus sign or a little cross. And that's it. So here, if you wanted to weave in ends, you can knot it, weave in the ends, and then start over again. I'm a little lazy, so what I did is I just hid the thread through the blanket itself. So I inserted my needle here through the stitch and then just went through hiding it. Make sure that the needle doesn't pop through the liner, all right? So as you're sewing along, just give nice light stitching. Make sure that you're going through the back side of the blanket, but not so far as to poke through the liner. So I'm just going to give a few stitches. When you get to the stitching in the opposite color, so let's say I was using that orange thread, the easiest thing to do is to stay on the orange argyle and not cross through the white, and that way you won't see the stitching as much. But if you're a little more adventurous or you have a little more experience and you just don't care, you can just stitch all the way across. So that's not a problem. Remember that this is your project. You can work on this however you want. All right, so I'm going to match my argyles. So I did the cross stitch here on this bottom one, and I want to do the same or do as close a placement on the argyle on top of that one. So the next argyle over. So I'm just going to try to place my needle as close to the center of this little rhombus. Okay, so that it's going to pop up right here in the middle. So it's kind of in a similar placement to the one that we did previously. And then right where my needle came out, I'm going to push it right back through, but make sure I go through the liner. So right here. And then just pull that thread through. And there we go. So now this one you can either stitch up, down, doesn't matter. Just make sure that it's in the same general direction as the cross stitch that you've previously done, so that they both look, in this case, like little plus signs. So I'm going to stitch down, and then I'm going to insert my needle through the blanket itself and poke it through the fabric like this. And we're going to poke through the fabric. All right, and now we want to space out the stitch evenly so that we have a nice even little cross. And there we go. And that's it. That is how you would cross stitch to secure the liner onto the blanket. Now the placement of the stitches is entirely up to you. So here is what the backside would look like, and as you can see, this is highly visible because I used a different color thread. So use the same color thread and you shouldn't have any issues in hiding the stitching at all. So just continue, I guess, cross stitching all the way until you finish your column, which in this blanket I had several little argyles to work through. Remember that I did space them differently, so I sewed into the first one, skipped the second, sewed on the third, and so forth. And then in the next column, I hid the thread all the way diagonally across so that I would go into that second argyle of column number 2. So then I cross stitch on the second argyle, skipped the third, stitched on the fourth, and instead of sewing all the way through here, I just went right across and down. So that in column number 3, I stitch on the first, skip second, stitch third, and so forth. So again, place your cross stitching wherever you want on the blanket. The more stitches you have, the tighter the liner is going to hold up against the blanket. If you just want it to look like a nice design and don't want it to pull too much, you don't need as many stitches. There you go. That was just a quick little tutorial for how to add a liner to your blanket. Now remember that this is a technique that you can use on any crochet and knit blanket of your choice. So it doesn't have to be specifically for this Argyle blanket. You can use it in all of your projects. Now, for those of you that have bought the Argyle blanket pattern or that would like to buy the Argyle blanket pattern, these instructions as well as photos are also included in the pattern. So you'll see how to do the how to add the liner as well as how to crochet the blanket itself. But that's our tutorial for today, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button. And if you want to see more of my work, you can follow me on Instagram. To find the pattern for this Argyle blanket, as well as all the other patterns that you see here on the channel, stop by modebespoke.com, and you can find a link to the website down in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in the next tutorial.